This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Freya Sirr.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show.
On today's show, Enda will be looking at novelist Elizabeth Taylor.
And our Toaster Challenge guest is Sarah Bannan, Head of Literature at the Arts Council and also a writer herself.
And we'll be looking at the last collection by the late Lee Harwood.
So, the coffee's made.
The toast is on.
And the books are on the table.
So, Enda, you want to talk today about a writer that you admire?
Yeah, I would like to talk about a writer called Elizabeth Taylor, not the actress, but the English writer.
Kind of an unfortunate name for a writer in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think actually she really suffered from this because people were always thinking, oh, it's Elizabeth Taylor, the actress. And I mean, you know, you've got the glamorous Elizabeth Taylor married to Richard Burton, and then you have what people perceived as this dowdy middle-class English writer living in the suburbs of London. But really, she was far from that.
So who was she?
Well, she was born in 1912, so she was very much a writer of the 20th century, and she died in 1975, actually weirdly around the time that Elizabeth Taylor remarried Richard Burton. But she, as I said, she was very much a 20th century writer. Kingsley Amis regarded her as one of the best English novelists born in the century. Her first book was At Mrs. Lippincot's, which she wrote during the Second World War. So that kind of gives you the time span of when she was writing while her husband was in the Royal Air Force. And it was followed up by 11 novels and a children's book. So she was really prolific. And well-known novels of hers include Angel, which is a really, really interesting read, and A Wreath of Roses. And her second last novel, Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont, that was actually the first book that I read by her. You may have seen it around the house, Peter, but it's set in a retirement hotel where an older woman, Mrs. Palfrey, befriends a younger man. And even that idea of a retirement hotel, it's kind of strange, isn't it, Peter? I mean, would you like to live in a retirement hotel?
I would love it.
Kind of interesting, wouldn't it? But that's the kind of, you see, she's great at capturing particular time and things that happened in it. So this idea, I wouldn't mind going to a retirement hotel either, but Mrs. Palfrey is in the retirement hotel and she spends her time befriending this younger man, and he leads her into her past and she leads him to his future. So it was a really good book, and as soon as I read that book I was totally hooked. It was also turned into a movie with Joan Plowright. So I think really once you encounter Elizabeth Taylor, I think you're very lucky really, because you're entering a fantastic world of writing.
And yet it's strange, because at the same time, like, she was certainly underrated, wasn't she? I mean, she's a writer. She's best known for not being better known in a way, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's
a good way of putting it. Actually, she is best known for not being better known, and maybe that kind of helped her in a way, because then when you discover her, it's just such an amazing thing. So she, as I said, she wrote in the suburbs, and her husband was the owner of a local confectionery factory. Can you imagine that? And she had a very quiet routine, she said. In interviews, she described working out the plots of her books while she did the ironing. Now, that can sound very boring and domestic, but what appears on the page is absolutely brilliant. She said, "I've had a rather uneventful life, thank God." She said this to the London Times, but she said, "Another more eventful world intrudes from time to time in the form of fan letters to the other Elizabeth Taylor." I think this is quite funny as well. "Men write to me and ask for a picture of me in my bikini, and my husband thinks I should send him one and shake them, but I haven't got a bikini." So these are the kind of things that happen to her.
Kind of reminds me of somebody like Maeve Brennan in a way, the Irish writer. He's often kind of missed out on in some ways. Only recently, people have been paying her more attention.
Yeah, that's true. Like Maeve Brennan, I think, missed out upon. And yet all of life is present in her books. Elizabeth Jane Howard, another underrated writer, wrote, "I reread Elizabeth Taylor's novel because she increases my sense of reality." Indeed, there's, I think, no better writer at revealing reality than Elizabeth Taylor. It shines through in every line of hers. Her stories are lives of quiet desperation, and they're kind of against the background of polite afternoon tea and English life. But you find extraordinary detail that illuminates the kind of superficially ordinary life. And you really get into what that looks like. She knew very well the endless, dreary tasks of post-war domestic life and motherhood. And she wasn't afraid, really, to describe the hard work and the courage of her female characters. And many of her characters suffer because they can't really bear to confess their loneliness, their anger, their terror at night, as she says.
And you wanted to say something about the way she wrote?
Yeah, well, you see, I was so interested. I suppose if you write yourself, I was really interested in her process of writing. And I found this quote from her where she says, I write in scenes rather than in narrative, which I find boring. I am pleased if the look of a page is interesting, broken by paragraphs or dialogue, not just one dense slab of print. I thought that was interesting as well because she's very interested in painting. She's very interesting as a person in going to art galleries and buying paintings. I thought it was quite painterly the way she described the text on the page. And she also spoke about the driving force of characterization in her work. She wrote to her American publisher in 1948 and she said, people are my only adventures and I hope never to have any others. And though I don't use their characters in my books, their company constantly replenishes me and inspires me to be allowed to be ordinary and live among ordinary people, though no one is really that, is the only way that I can write. And I expect that this limits my range, but I have no gift for anything else. So she's very, very honest, really, about what she says about
So
writing.
obviously, like an accomplished novelist, but at the same time, it's not her novels that you're going to talk about today in particular, isn't it? But her stories.
Yeah, I really do want to talk about her stories. They started out appearing, like you spoke about Maeve Brennan earlier, they started appearing from the 1940s up to the 60s, and they were in publications like Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, The New Yorker, at a time when, as you said, Maeve Brennan was publishing Mary Lavin, Frank O'Connor, and a lot of them published under the famous editorship of William Maxwell. And this volume that I'm holding here at the breakfast table was published in 2012 because it was to celebrate 100 years since her birth in 1912, and it gathers all her stories together. And they're really fantastic
What
stories.
makes them stand out for you?
Well, what makes them stand out for me is there is, I think, a really sophisticated precision to her writing. There is an emotional accuracy. As I said earlier, she knows about people and how they live together, kind of behind closed curtains, the loneliness, the unspoken pain. She's good on the kind of private crisis of marriage. We know nothing about that, Peter. Sure, we don't. Parenthood and growing older. And almost invariably, her books end on a note of irresolution. I like that. They fall into a silence. And Bailey, he did a really fantastic introduction to many of her Virago books. And he described her particular talent with stories. He said, the short story form is one that attracts the swift glance rather than the long, cold stare. And Elizabeth Taylor is one of the great glancers. I think that's really, really great way of describing her work.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned William Maxwell in the New Yorker. I mean, he was kind of a famous editor who nurtured a lot of writers. So I suppose she was lucky in the editors that she encountered.
Yeah, I think really that you realise that editors are very important the more you write. And Elizabeth Taylor's first published work was a short story in Tribune, For Thine is the Power, it was called, and it appeared in 1944. And it was accepted by no less than George Orwell himself. He was the new literary editor. She'd been rejected before by Reginald Moore at Modern Reading the previous year, but Orwell took it on, and thank God he did, really, because he set her off on the path. And then another story, Better Not, was published in the same year, 1944, and that was edited by John Middleton Murray. But of course, there was Robert Maxwell in the New Yorker. He guided her well, and he published many of her short stories. And it's really interesting, actually, in the collected stories, which I'm holding up for you there, Peter, because there's a great introduction from her daughter, Joanna Kingham. And she describes how Catherine White and William Maxwell, the literary editors of The New Yorker, became great friends of her mother, and how often at Christmas time The New Yorker would send over a large ham. And it was a real treat, which was really scarce in England. And you see, Elizabeth Taylor, really, there isn't much known about her life, so I loved to hear those little details. And she also dedicated her collection of stories, The Blush, to William Maxwell. And just as a funny aside as well, the daughter tells of her mother listening to the morning story on the BBC radio, and she was making the beds at the same time. And apparently she loved to listen to these stories. When suddenly she hears a story that she recognises and she thinks, that sounds familiar. And then she realises that it is her own story, and that there'd been this man who had been taking stories from the New Yorker, pretending they were his, and then sending them into the BBC. So those little details can be quite comical. And actually, as you read the stories, you realise that Elizabeth Taylor has a lot of wit and humour to her stories
Are
too.
they quite autobiographical?
Well, yeah, you see, I suppose she gets into the tiny intimacies of domestic life, and the daughter does reveal that a lot of things that happened in their life ended up in the stories. Her collection, The Dedicated Man, was dedicated to the English writer Robert Liddell. She had a long-standing friendship with him. And it began with a very long correspondence. And Robert Liddell lived in Athens. And so it was a long time until they met. But he himself later wrote a book about his friendship with Ivy Compton Burnett and Elizabeth Taylor in his memoir, Elizabeth and Ivy, which came out in 1986. And he points to this story called The Letter Writers, which is in the collected stories. And it's about two writers who correspond to each other for over a decade. And they never meet until this particular point when they decide that they will. And that's the beginning part of that short story.
Yeah, I mean, you really like the story. I mean, what do you really like about it?
Yeah, it is true that this story, The Letter Writers by Elizabeth Taylor, is one that really stays with me in the way that, say, a story like The Demon Lover by Elizabeth Bowen or A Lady and a Lapdog by Chekhov has stayed with me, or Tobias Wolff's Bullet in the Head, all these brilliant stories. Hers really stands out as well. I think she knew very well about the terrible emotion of embarrassment, as she says. And this story is about the terrible shyness which is suffered by the character Emily, because she's waiting for the arrival of this famous writer Edmund, who she's never met. But a bit like in the real life situation with Taylor writing to Little, they've been writing back and forth all the time. And it's quite intense. She says she stood before an alarming crisis, one that she'd hoped to avoid for as long as ever she lived, the crisis of meeting for the first time the person whom she knew best in the world. And he lives in Rome, and she went there once, but she was too shy to call on him. But now he's coming, and there's a huge sense of tension in this story. And if you like, Peter, I'll read a piece. Would you like that?
Yeah, I would, yeah.
I just have to rummage here through the pages and find it, but it's a good piece. So let's see. I love the feeling that she's there waiting and waiting and waiting for him. Yeah, so the tension. She says, he knows too much about me, so where can we begin? She wondered. She had confided such intimacies in him. At that distance, he was as safe as the confessional, with the added freedom from hearing any words said aloud. She'd written to his mind only. He seemed to have no face and certainly no voice. Although photographs had once passed between them, they had seemed meaningless. She had been so safe with him. They could not have wounded one another, but now they might. In 10 years, there had been no inadvertent hurts of rivalry, jealousy, or neglect. It had not occurred to either to wonder if the other would somehow cease to write. The letters would come as surely as the sun. But will they now? Emily was wondering. She turned to the familiar bend of the road, and the sea lay glittering below, its wrinkled surface looking solid and without movement, like a great sheet of metal. Now and then a light breeze came off the water and rasped together the dried grasses on the banks. When it dropped, the late morning silence held, drugging the brain and slowing the limbs.
It's a procession of disasters.
Oh yeah, it is a procession of disasters because she gets nervous. She drinks too much, a little bit too much sherry. There's great details, like she's going to the well to pull out the bottle of wine that's been cooling there, and the rope from the well makes her dress all green and dirty. And then the cat tries to eat the lobster that she'd got for the lunch, and it goes on, and then he arrives. And that makes it sound comical, but really you're feeling just the tension of what's coming. So it's a brilliant story, and I think if anyone wants to start off by reading her in this collection, I would recommend that as a great one to start with.
What would you say is her legacy as a writer?
I think it's kind of conflicting. Like Hilary Mantel said that she's deft, accomplished, and somewhat underrated. And Rosamond Lehman describes her as sophisticated, sensitive, and brilliantly amusing. I mean, these are all fantastic comments. But then you have somebody like Joyce Carol Oates in the Washington Post who says there is a distressing similarity between Taylor's many stories, an assumption which somehow destroys a reader's enjoyment of her art. They are imagined as interior creations, she says of her characters, existing within the confines of their particular stories, and they are made to be and even to feel inferior. Now that's really awful.
That's a real dismissal, yeah.
And then more recently, Sarah Waters said she remains one of the great underread and underappreciated British writers of the 20th century. So really, I suppose you're talking about her legacy. I just think it's going to be a really fine one if readers can find her. And I highly recommend this book, The Complete Short Stories of Elizabeth Taylor. And also, I suppose we're relying on people like the Virago Press and the New York Review of Books, because these are going to keep her stories out there. You are probably right in a sense when you're saying she was underrated. She's been too long, I think, a writer's writer, and it would be great if she became a reader's writer.
Thanks, Enda. So that was Enda talking about Elizabeth Taylor, Complete Short Stories, published by Virago Modern Classics, and details, as always, on our site, booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com.
Thanks, Peter. And now it's time for the Toaster Challenge, where we invite a guest in to talk about a book that they really love, that they've been moved by. And today I'd like to welcome Sarah Bannan Keegan, author and head of literature in the Arts Council.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here, Sarah. Well, just to say a few things about Sarah. Sarah was born in Watertown, New York. She went to Georgetown University. And following graduation from there, Sarah moved to Ireland in 2000. She's worked in various arts organisations, including the Irish Film Institute and Lilliput Press. And since 2007, she's been head of literature with the Arts Council. And in 2010, 2011, she completed the Faber Academy's novel writing course in Dublin. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because Sarah's first novel, Weightless, which was a tale of teenage angst in Alabama, was published in 2015 by Bloomsbury in the UK and St. Martin's Press in the US, as well as being translated into several languages. Here in Ireland, the Irish Times compared it to the Pulitzer Prize winner Jeffrey Eugenides' book, The Virgin Suicide. So praise indeed for your book, Sarah. Sarah lives in Dublin with her husband and 2 children. And on the subject of children, I think it should be mentioned that children's creative welfare has always been important to Sarah. At the Arts Council, she developed the first policy for children's literature and initiated Ireland's first children's laureate, which is going to tie into the Toaster Challenge in a little bit. Personally, I have to say, I know Sarah as a really avid and enthusiastic reader, and that will also be of great help to the Toaster Challenge. So, Sarah, you are extremely welcome to Books for Breakfast.
Thank you so much. I've been loving the podcast, so thanks for having me on.
Oh, that's great. So, Sarah, from Watertown, New York to Ireland, what made you come here and also make you stay for 20 years?
Oh, it's a kind of it's a pretty cliched story, I suppose. I wanted to do a year abroad for my 3rd year in college, and I didn't have much of a faculty for languages. I needed to go someplace English speaking. I had a frenemy who decided to go to Scotland, and I thought, I'm not going there. I'll go to Ireland instead. So I don't know that it was motivated for the most noble of reasons, but at the same time I came, and I think within 1 or 2 weeks of being in Dublin I absolutely fell in love with it. So I started at Trinity for the year, and I made some great friends, and I met my now husband about a month in. And I fell in love with the city, the size of it. I fell in love with the writing and the contemporary literary scene. I worked really hard so I could stay on, and I got an internship at Lilliput, and I had to go back and finish my degree in the States, but came back 1 month after graduating college to come and live here, and lived for a while in North Great Georgia Street with my husband, and the rest is kind of history. But
it sounds very adventurous.
Yeah, well, not really, because in a way I think I moved around a lot as a kid growing up, and so I've worked out that I've lived in Ireland longer than I've lived anywhere in my whole life, which I think is why I have such a strange accent. Once I came to Dublin, I thought, no, this is the place for me.
Oh, that's brilliant. So there was a real sense of homecoming when you came here.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's great. But you wrote your novel Weightless here in Dublin. So for all your travels, you wrote it in Dublin, but it's not set in Ireland. It's set in Adamsville, Alabama, and it centres around the arrival of a new girl to Adamsville High, 15-year-old Carolyn Lessing. She's really cool, isn't she, Sarah? She's a cool character with gorgeous looks. She's talented and everything. But actually, her story becomes less than perfect, less than cool. It actually becomes very tragic. So I was just wondering, could you tell the listeners a little bit about her story without giving away too much, and also the real life tragedy that inspired you to write it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose the novel began for me as a scene, and it was a scene that I wrote actually even when I was in college. So I think I'd been carrying it around with me for a long time. So I went to high school in a place not dissimilar from the fictional place that I described. Obviously, I dramatized it and brought it
Mm.
into contemporary times. But I went to a small high school in Alabama where the most popular girls in school were cheerleaders, and we voted on them, and the football players were very popular, and it was a very kind of
Yeah.
rigid social hierarchy. And I suppose I was always really interested in how that played out because I came into that. We moved a lot, as I say, and I came into that as an outsider. And I was quite different from the character that I described. I was not very cool, and I was not very
Yeah.
beautiful, but I was an observer, and I was really, really interested in that. So yeah, I wanted to write a story about what it's like to be kind of perceived as perfect, and what it's like to be an outsider. And I suppose a lot of the reviews at the time talked about the book being about bullying, and I guess I was interested in that, but I was more kind of interested in the ideas of people who don't maybe necessarily take direct action and bully, but people who stand back and watch. So that was one of the things that is a bit different about the book, is it's told from the point of view of an anonymous group of girls. So it's told in the first person plural. And I think that was one of the first things that came to me about the book, was
Yeah.
kind of passive observers who were watching bad things happen, and didn't really have the courage to speak up, because I think that's a lot of what can happen during that time of our lives. And I think I was probably more in that group than being a kind of a courageous
Yeah.
hero. So yeah, so it's about a girl coming to a town initially beloved, and then
Yeah.
what it's like to maybe stand out, and how a town deals with change and anything that challenges the status quo.
Yeah. I mean, you spoke about bullying there, and that's the message that schools really want to get out to children, to not stand back and be silent, but to speak up. So I think that's a really important message. You spoke about using the first person plural voice there, the we throughout the book, which is really unusual novelistic device. And I was just wondering, I know you said a little bit about it there, but did that help you to get into the mindset of, the social pressures, the texting, the emailing, the blogging, all those things that are in the book? Did that help you a lot as a device, as a writer?
Yeah, no, it did. And I mean, I heard you guys on the podcast, you talked a while back to Alice Lyons about the book Una, and so that book is really interesting because she writes the whole book without using the letter O. And on one level, I think people think, oh God, that's such a good constraint. But actually, sometimes a constraint can be very freeing for the writer. And so once I really committed to writing something in that point of view, I found it very easy to get into that mindset, a mindset that is not wholly your own. Because I think that time of early teenagehood is a time when, your brain is at a very delicate phase of kind of becoming an adult brain, and making
Mm.
decisions in that in a different kind of way. But also you're so connected to kind of the hive mind, and so I guess I wanted to explore that. But like that too, for me as a writer, it was great to have that constraint, because I thought, well, the girls can only see this, they can't know that, and we can't get into this. So there were kind of limits to what it could observe, which I think, can be frustrating for the reader, but is also a kind of a different experience as well.
Yeah, and as you said there, it was a liberation. I mean, when I read Alice Lyon's a book, I didn't even notice that the O was missing. But for her, it did give her that liberation. And it sounds like it was similar for you, using the we throughout. And I'm just thinking back to 2015 when you wrote Weightless. It was a really busy time for you. I'm sure you were a young mother, you were working in the Arts Council, dealing with arts and writers and artists all day. Was it very hard for you in that period of your life to come home and then to have to write, to set up a new structure when you got back? That work-life balance, was it tricky for you?
Yeah, yeah, no, and I haven't really mastered it. I really haven't mastered it yet. So I'm really fascinated in how other writers work and how people manage their time and that. And I mean, it's worth also noting that I wrote Weightless. I wrote the several drafts of it before I actually had my first child. And so I think there's a clue in
Yeah.
that. And then I did redrafts when she was small, but it was all around taking, leave from work. And I've tried that thing of waking at 4 a.m. and tried to get my words in then. And I don't think I'm that soldier,
I think
so
everyone goes through that, Sarah. So
yeah,
don't be too down on
yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, but no, I mean, I'm really, really lucky in the job that I have because it's really, really inspiring, and it is fantastic to be able to spend my days kind of thinking about writing and writers and publishing. And so, if I hadn't been in this job, I don't think I would have had I go to festivals all the time for work and get to hear writers talk about their processes and their books. I read a ton. So I'm in a really enviable position in terms of just that, as I say, like my day job is thinking about these things all the time. Now, sometimes I do find that a
Yeah.
bit oppressive as well because I'm so blown away by
Yeah.
how much talent there is. And it's just, you kind of think, God, is there any original story left to be told, or is there an original way to tell it? But I think, because I have so many demands on my time, writing really needs to be something I want to do and enjoy. And I have to say, making Weightless really was. It was. I never thought it would be published. I never thought it would see the light of day, and that was also kind of liberating because it was just an exercise to see if I could actually finish a book. So now I'm in an exercise of trying to finish a second book, and I will get to the end of that, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah, but that's great. It is a journey, Sarah. I think every writer would say that. Well, just to say as well, I think you wrote a highly original book in Weightless. And I love one reviewer who said Sarah Bannan traces deceit and hatred, rage and revenge as it encircles the hearts and minds of unchecked youth. Weightless is a book I would recommend to parents and their teenage children. At its core is a subject that demands to be confronted. So I do think, Sarah, you've written a great book there, and congratulations. You spoke there about working in the arts as well. And I suppose just to finish our chat on this bit before we head into the Toaster Challenge, I was just wondering, like, the arts has been so badly hit by the COVID pandemic. Do you think that we are heading in, will there be some hope for the arts in the future? Because so many artists have had such a tricky time at the moment, and they're worried, I suppose, and concerned about heading forward.
Yeah, I mean, all I can say is that since March, I've been both blown away by how resilient people have been, and how inventive, I suppose, a lot of the arts organizations have been, the publishers, people like Children's Books Ireland, who, within a month of lockdown had distributed Imagination to every household in Ireland. So there have been really, really innovative and exciting things that have happened during that time. I am also conscious that, I think on the face of it, one might think that this would be a great time for writers, because look at all this time alone and look at all this isolation. But just, I think anyone who knows anything about creativity and how it works is that it's very, very difficult to be creative, and very, very difficult to work artistically when you're anxious about money, about livelihood, about health. So I think it's been it goes without saying that it's been a really, really difficult period. We have a great board, and they have been in really close conversation with government from the get-go in securing additional resources. And I think, more than ever, just to be getting money into the hands of artists to allow them the space and freedom to work is really, really important. I think we're kind of thinking that next year will be a prolonged period of commissioning, rehearsal, and development more than anything. And I think if people can kind of get into that mindset, we'll absolutely get through it. But I mean, the fact of the matter is like lockdown would have been so awful if normal people hadn't been on, and if and if we hadn't been able to listen to Rita Ann Higgins on the radio, and if we hadn't been able to continue to get books from the bookshop. So there were so many parts of lockdown that were actually good and comforting, and most of those things involved art, and artists. So they can't be taken for granted. So no, I feel absolutely optimistic because the work is still being made, but I also wouldn't underestimate how hard it is for people. And I have the security of my work,
right.
but I know myself that and no one in my family has been has been unwell, but it's been just like a super anxious time to be alive, and I don't think that is great for creativity.
Yeah, I know. And I think
Yeah.
banding together and supporting each other as much as we can is going to be the way forward as
Yeah.
well. And even Sarah, this wonderful
Yeah.
podcast that is happening as well. I just think if we can help each other as much as we can, and it certainly sounds, as you said there, that there is huge support coming from the Arts Council and that there's a new team there, which is exciting too. So that's good. So, Sarah, thanks a million for that. I think you are well warmed up now for the Toaster Challenge, and we're very excited to hear what is the book that you've brought in that has touched you or moved you in some way. I'm really interested in hearing about it. And Peter is getting the bread ready, and he is putting it down into the toaster. 1, 2, 3, and go.
So, my Toaster Challenge is the absolutely brilliant novel Here is the Beehive by Sarah Crossan. So, Sarah Crossan is an Irish writer. She is best known to audiences as a YA writer, and she was our fifth laureate in Anogue, our fifth children's laureate. And I suppose she's a really original and distinctive writer. And one of the things that people would remark about Sarah or would be noteworthy about her work is that she often writes in verse, not all the time, but often. And Here's the Beehive is her first novel for adults. And it's a story of a woman named Anna Kelly. So we kind of get a clue from that from the very beginning. And on the first page, we find out that the only way out now is to stay busy. So I have borrowed Anna Karenina from my mother and will not allow myself to cry until I have read it twice. So it's a story of an affair. Anna Kelly, a married woman with children, an affair with a married man with children, Connor. But it's a twist because we find out again very, very early on that Connor has died in a tragic accident. And Rebecca, his wife, and Anna, our narrator, form a kind of an unlikely, self-destructive, perhaps, friendship. And so it's a familiar story, but told in a very unfamiliar way. And I read the book twice. I read it first in proof form because it's only just out. And it was the first book that I was actually able to complete during lockdown, that I was able to completely absorb myself in because I was so entranced by the plot, the language, and the characters. And that's just one thing about Sarah Crossan. The reviews have picked her up on it. She writes in verse, but plot is like king to her. So like you cannot stop turning the pages and you get through it really, really quickly because, of course, there are very few words. But then I read it a second time, and the second time I read it, I was just blown away by the technical achievement of the whole thing. And I do think she is a magician because through so few words, Sarah is able to convey character, plot, image. She has a very distilled way of telling a story. There are so many images that have stayed with me from it. There's a scene in the park and they go to a roundabout and it talks about a roundabout, not a roundabout, merry-go-round, anyway, spitting off a child. And I think I'll never watch one of those again without thinking they're spitting off a child. But I think it's kind of like a Russian doll of a novel. So there are layers upon layers, but also like looking at the inside of a clock because it's going back and forth through time. And it all sounds very complicated, but actually she just does it so seamlessly. And that's what I mean about her being a magician. So yeah, no, it's fabulous. And the narrator is not particularly likable, and the reviews have kind of picked that up, but I loved that about it because you don't warm to her initially. And yeah, no, it's a great read, but really, really beautiful and very, very cleverly done.
Oh, it sounds absolutely brilliant, Sarah. Thank you so much for that. And just listening to you talking there about the verse novel, a bit like Alice Lyon's No O in her novel, do you notice that? You're saying it's a page turner. Does that help you turning the page or?
It does, absolutely. And I suppose one of the things about, like, it's the rhythm of each line. So, and you feel like it's actually being read aloud to you as you go along. Now, I will say I've read Sarah's YA novels as well, which are just superb. I mean, she really is a fantastic writer. And in those books, the poems are titled, and they are actually individual poems. And there might be a concrete poem there, but most of it is in blank verse. Whereas the poems are just separated by like a little graphic in the novel. And I asked Sarah about this actually, how she decided to do that, but it was just to keep the reader going along. Now it is divided into 5 parts. And interestingly, you only find out that Anna, the narrator, is a mother about 100 pages into it, which some of the reviews have picked up on and have been critical of. But I think that's, again, brilliant because it's just challenging your perceptions of, what a woman should be like and what a mother should be like. And, it's really well done.
Yeah, I saw that review actually, but I like that idea that it's a slowly
Yeah.
unraveling novel, and then the fact that it's balancing these two intertwining marriages, and then is it believable that she then kind of is meeting up with, isn't she, the wife of the man who's dead?
Yeah, well, she's the lawyer. She's I think she's developing a. I can't remember if it's a will that she's initially meant to be doing for, but that's how she meets Connor. She's his lawyer. She's his
Okay.
lawyer, and so when Rebecca, the wife, gets on because she has to execute the will, they become kind of friends that way. Oh no, it feels very very natural and very. I mean, it seems very self-destructive that she pursues this friendship, but it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
It's really really fascinating, and the other woman becomes the other woman.
Yeah, I mean, I saw her talking at the Hay Festival. I saw a little clip of her speaking, and she's herself hugely enthusiastic as a writer and a speaker, isn't she? And she was telling this brilliant story that when she was an English teacher, you've probably heard the story before, that a student said to her, Miss, she was telling them all about how to believe in their dreams and follow their dreams. And he said, but did you always want to be an English teacher? And she thought this was a bit rude. And then she said, no, no. And he said, well, what did you want to be? And she said, a writer. And so then she began, going back to study and do creative writing. So it really is a dream what's happened to her in a way, isn't it? She followed her dream and she's had so much success with books like One and Toffee and Moonrise, all those books for young children as well. They've entered our house as well with our daughter. But this book anyway sounds absolutely brilliant, Sarah. So I'm looking forward to reading Here is the Beehive, and thank you for recommending it. Peter, I'm just wondering now, has the toast been toasted? Okay. So, Sarah, that was Sarah Bannan, head of literature in the Arts Council and also author, talking to us about her wonderful novel Weightless, which is published by Bloomsbury. And Sarah also came in to talk about Sarah Crosson's book, Here is the Beehive, which is just out, just published. Sarah's wildly recommending it, and it's also published by Bloomsbury. And as usual, all details on these books will be available on booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. Thanks, Sarah. So, Peter, what have you got on the table this week?
I've got a collection by Lee Harwood. It's called The Orchid Boat, and it was published by Enitharmon Press a few years ago, but I just got hold of it recently, and it's the collection that I've enjoyed a lot by a poet I find very interesting.
Yeah, I've seen you reading it, and I've heard you saying great things about it. So I'm really looking forward to you sharing some more information with us about Lee Harwood. But first of all, to start off, could you give us some background to him?
Well, I suppose, I mean, you could think of him as certainly one of the leading poets of his generation, although maybe better known in some circles than in others, because, the poetry world can be a bit of a divided place at times. He was born in Leicester in 1939. He died a few years ago in 2015. And I mean, he lived in Brighton, I suppose, for most of his life, but he did spend time in the US and Greece and elsewhere. He did lots of different jobs. He was a bookseller. He worked in a post office. He was even a bus conductor at one point of his life. But he published over 20 volumes of poetry, fiction, and translations, including his collected poems, 1964 to 2004, which Shearsman Books published. And I first came across in one of those old Paladin series of poems that came out, oh, it must be back in the 80s now, but this one was called Crossing the Frozen River, and it was his selected poems, and it was the first time I really read him at any length. So, I mean, just say a couple of things about him. I mean, America was important for him. The New York School of Poets in particular. He was very close, for example, to John Ashbery. And indeed, one of his best known poems, the one that opens that Paladin selection, is The Man with Blue Eyes, which is about a relationship that he had with Ashbery. He's very much associated with the British and American avant-garde, the so-called British poetry revival. Poets like Bob Cobbing or Tom Raworth or Eric Mottram and Andrew Crozier, or the kind of younger generation, John Hall, John James, Ken Edwards, Chris Creek, Tony Lopez, and Denise Riley, indeed, or the Black Mountain poets in the US. I mean, that's his context, if you like. Although actually his work isn't really much like a lot of that. The thing about it is that it's extraordinarily clear, often extraordinarily direct. It incorporates the personal. You really get the sense of a lived life from his work. Love poems, place poems, The Long Black Veil, which is an early extended love poem, for example. So, in that sense, he writes maybe as much in the tradition of John Clare and Wordsworth as the 20th century avant-garde. So that's sort of a little bit about his background.
So is his work very experimental, and is it difficult work to read?
Yeah, experimental is a tricky word. I mean, lots of poetry is experimental, and it can mean lots of different things. I mean, he is in a way, but he's very approachable, a very kind of welcoming poet, I find. The actual language he uses, for instance, is always very simple. It's a spoken language used by everybody with what August Kleinzahler has called its eerie directness. But of course, he's the first to acknowledge that language is always pretty problematic. I mean, he said language is never perfectly reliable, obviously enough, but it's all we have to talk to one another. And that was in the introduction to his collected poems. So, I mean, the poems are always attempts at communication. They move towards their readers rather than away from them. But you could say, I mean, the arrangement of the material, or the disposition of the lines within a poem, for instance, can be pretty intriguing. He doesn't fit in all the gaps, that is. I mean, he leaves loads of room for the reader's own imagination. So, you have to do a bit of work when you read him, but it's never off-putting. I mean, I just want to tell you the truth, he says in one poem. But he's also said, I'm more interested in work that has a delay fuse on it, that you have to think about and wrestle with and go back and forth with. And that's an idea that appeals a lot to me, the poem with a delay fuse.
I kind of agree with that as well. I think going back to a poem that is challenging always gives rewards, I think, but you have to put your work in, as you were saying there, that he recommended. But just getting back to the Orchid Boat, what was the overall appeal for you?
Again, I suppose it's that kind of trademark, simplicity, openness. You never know with his work. You never know where a poem is going to go to. I mean, just to take the opening poem of that book, Departures. A hot summer night, the sound of rain in the courtyard, a satin breeze sways the curtains. She wrote, gently I open my silk dress and float alone on the orchid boat. Who can take a letter beyond the clouds? And you're wondering, who is she? What's going on? What's the situation? And then you find that those lines are taken from a poem, Sorrows of Departure, by the Chinese poet Li Jingqiao from the 12th century. And they're kind of two Chinese poems capturing the story of two lovers. And then the 20th century poet reflecting on it, and the kind of dim past and the present inhabiting each other. The letter will reach the other side of the mountains. Clouds will roll back clear of the summits. What was needed was done, but never done. It's never done. And then the poem becomes an attempt to imagine this orchid boat. What could it be? And by the end, the poet, or whoever's speaking, it's all kind of very fluid, is able to step into the boat. Without thinking, I step aboard the orchid boat, the feet of silk carrying me beyond all mirrors. So I kind of like the way, a lot of things are happening sort of simultaneously. I mean, in the book, a lot of different stories and histories get mixed up. Lines like, she climbed down from the trees the next day, a queen after many adventures. Beyond the wood, a field sloped down to a wide river, its banks edged with reeds. And then it can move from that to a history of libraries. Remember the library in Alexandria. Remember its destruction by Christian fanatics and the savage murder of the mathematician Hypatia. Bishop Cyril, may you be tormented forever in your imaginary hell. You and the other dark heart, Archbishop Theophilus. Shame on you all. And then suddenly you're with his father as a young officer in 1940, having to shoot one of his own men, his stomach ripped open beyond saving, begging to be put out of his agony, and, back again to a childhood memory. So I kind of like the way that there is that kind of back and forthness, if you like. They're poems that you have to sit in front of and think about. The spaces around them are important. The leaks and the gaps, and, all the indirection of the human mind. You get a sense of a human mind at work. And so, but, sometimes they can be totally bare and unadorned as well.
And do you have an example, Peter, that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I love this one, Objects on a Polish Table. I was going to say, Enda, do you want to read that?
Yeah, I've no problem. So, Objects on a Polish Table. 4 books, 2 newspapers, an ashtray, a pack of cigarettes, matches. 2. When visitors are coming, some poppy seed cake or donuts or fresh baked macaronici placed on a table. A lace tablecloth beneath the coffee cups. 3. A ceramic salt bowl with a lid. 4. An empty vase in the centre of the oilcloth. Come and sit down.
So you can't get any kind of simpler or more direct or less ambiguous than that. There's a poem in it. It's kind of interesting. There's a poem in it called Leah Laforgue, which tells the amazing story of his great granddad. And it turns out that she was actually married to the French poet Jules Laforgue, who was such a big influence on Eliot. And she went to Berlin as a young woman, made a living teaching English. One of her students turned out to be the poet, who was the French reader to the Empress Augusta. And shortly afterwards, they got married, and then they moved to Paris. And then, sadly, they both got TB, and they died within a year of each other. And at the end, he says, I'm not making this up. And I suppose that's kind of, in a way, part of his point. The world is so full of interesting objects, facts, or life. You don't really have to make stuff up. But he's also he's full of stories. As he says, poems are stories too. The whole history of poetry is all to do with telling stories. Right from being a child, one has this deep need for and pleasure in being told a story. Such, stories and images. The poems are often very painterly. And again, he has said that for him they're kind of substitute paintings by proxy.
Well, you gave me his selected poems once as a present, published by Shearsman Books, and I really liked a poem of his called Coming Out of Winter. So it's called Coming Out of Winter, and he dedicated it to Paul. On a bright winter morning, sunlight catching the tops of white buildings, a tree outlined against the sea, a wall of flints, the luxury of being alive when the waves crash on the shore and a fresh wind streams up the narrow streets. A moment like this lightens the darkness a little, lifts the heart until you can walk down the hill near Careless. How can that be? Suddenly slammed up against a wall by memories of the dead, loved ones completely gone from this place, shafts of sunlight cutting through the clouds onto the ever-changing sea below. How many times we discuss the sea's colours, all beyond description, words, a mere hint of what's before our eyes, then and now.
Great. So that was The Orchid Poet by Lee Harwood, published by Enitharmon Press. And we also read from Lee Harwood's Selected Poems, which is published by Shearsman Books. And details, as usual, are on booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sirr here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again next Thursday morning. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.